The air at the co-op that spring morning in '73 hung thick with the smells of treated seed corn and fresh diesel. It was a smell of promise, of a world waking up. And for most farmers in Cedar County, that promise was spelled out in six-figure bank loans and brand-new equipment. I was standing by the parts counter, a worn-out hydraulic fitting clutched in my grease-stained hand, listening to old man Hemlock try to talk me into trading in my John Deere 4020. "Silas, that thing's a relic," he said, wiping his sweaty brow with a red rag. "It was a good tractor in its day, but its day was 10 years ago. You can't keep up with a two-wheel drive gasser." "It's diesel, and it's paid for, Henry," I said, my voice low and even. I didn't like arguing, but I liked being told how to run my own farm even less. My father had bought that 4020 new in '64. He'd paid cash for it after 3 straight years of bumper crops. It was the last major purchase he ever made before the cancer took him. That tractor wasn't just steel and rubber to me, it was a monument to a way of life, to the principle of owning what you worked. Just then, a shadow fell over the open bay door, followed by a roar that drowned out the hum of the feed grinder. A monstrous shape, painted a lurid shade of lime green and bigger than any tractor I'd ever seen up close, rolled to a stop, its dual tires churning the gravel. The letters on the side were stark and black. Steiger. At the wheel, perched high in the climate-controlled cab, was Richard Sterling. He killed the big Cummins engine, and the sudden silence felt heavy. Rich swung down from the cab, his boots clean, his jeans creased. He was my age, 35, but he carried himself like he owned the county. And with the way the bank was throwing money at him, he was well on his way. "Morning, Silas," he said, his voice slick with a confidence I never knew. Still trying to piece that museum exhibit back together. He nodded at the greasy fitting in my hand. A few of the other farmers hanging around the coffee pot chuckled. "Just regular maintenance, Rich," I replied, turning my attention back to the counter. "Regular maintenance is what the dealer does on my new Panther II, he boasted, slapping a dusty hand on the massive fender of his machine. "Got her delivered yesterday. 4-wheel drive, 300 horsepower. We'll be done planting our 2,000 acres before you get that old Deere of yours to fire on all 6 cylinders. He'd just picked up the old Miller place, another 800 acres, all on a note from the bank. The talk in town was that his operating loan was so big it made the bank president sweat. But they gave it to him anyway. The times were changing. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts was on the radio every day telling us to get big or get out, to plant fence row to fence row. Rich Sterling was his poster boy. Henry Hemlock scurried out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his overalls, his eyes wide with admiration for Rich's new iron. "She's a beaut, Rich, a real beaut. Bet that'll pull a 12-bottom plow without even grunting." "She will," Rich said, grinning. "The bank says a man's got to spend money to make money. Leverage, they call it. You ought to try it sometime, Silas. You're sitting on 300 acres of prime bottomland, free and clear. You could mortgage that and buy one of these, buy the section next to you. You're farming like your old man did, and he's been gone 10 years. The mention of my father tightened something in my chest. "My old man died without owing a single man a single dime," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "There's something to be said for that." Rich just laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You can't put something to be said for that in the bank, Silas. The Russians are buying all the grain we can grow. Corn's headed for $3 a bushel. A man would be a fool not to take advantage of it. You're sitting on a gold mine and trying to dig it out with a teaspoon." He turned and addressed the small crowd of onlookers. "This is the future, boys. Big power, big acres. You can't make a living on a quarter section with a 100-horse tractor anymore. It's a new day." They nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting the gleam of that new green paint. I saw it in their faces. They thought I was a dinosaur. A stubborn fool clinging to the past while the future was roaring by in a cloud of diesel smoke. I paid for my part, a simple $5 fitting, and walked out without another word. The sound of their laughter followed me to my pickup truck. Driving home, I passed Rich's new ground, the Miller place. The old fence rows were already gone, bulldozed into piles to make one massive field. His new Steiger was already out there, pulling a 24-foot chisel plow, eating up the earth in huge, effortless swaths. I looked across the road at my own farm, The fields were smaller, contoured to the roll of the land. The fences were still standing, trimmed and neat, marking the boundaries my grandfather had laid out with a horse and plough. I pulled into my own machine shed. The familiar smell of old oil, dirt and iron was a comfort. There she sat, my 4020. Her green paint was faded and chipped, the decal on the hood peeling at the edges. A spot of rust was starting to bubble up on the fender where a battery had leaked years ago. She wasn't pretty, she didn't have a cab or a radio, let alone air conditioning. But when I turned the key, that six-cylinder diesel engine roared to life with a sound as familiar and reassuring as my own heartbeat. It was the sound of ownership, the sound of independence. The world was telling me I was wrong. The bank, my neighbors, men like Rich Sterling, they all said my way was the way of the past. But as I backed the old tractor out into the sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that a promise made on a piece of paper, signed at a bank, wasn't the same as one sealed with a handshake and paid for with a man's own sweat. Before we go any further into this, I have to ask you something. Everyone who's ever worked the land remembers their first real tractor, or that one piece of equipment that was more than just a machine. The one you knew inside and out, the one that never let you down. What was yours? Drop a comment below and tell me about that old, reliable piece of iron you'd never part with. I'd honestly like to know. That spring was a long, hard one. While Rich Sterling finished planting in a week, I was still out there plugging away with my 6-row planter. The hydraulic fitting I'd bought was just the first of a dozen small things that went wrong. A fuel line cracked, the generator brushes wore out, the starter solenoid decided to get sticky on damp mornings. Each problem was a half-day lost, a trip to town, a few more dollars spent on parts. Each time I had the hood open, wrestling with a rusty bolt in the mud, I could see that giant green Steiger working on the horizon. It was a constant looming reminder of how far behind I was falling. The talk at the diner grew louder. Silas Blackwood's gonna lose his crop if he don't get it in the ground soon. Heard his tractor broke down again. Too proud to borrow a dime, and his pride is gonna starve him. One afternoon, the injector pump started acting up. The 4020 began to sputter and miss, blowing black smoke like a freight train. I knew what it was immediately. The timing was off, or one of the plungers was sticking. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart. Most guys would just pull the whole pump and send it to a specialist in Des Moines, a 2-week turnaround and a bill for $500. I didn't have the 2 weeks, and I sure as hell didn't have the $500 to spare. So I did what my father had taught me to do. I went to the shed, pulled out his old service manual, its pages soft and stained with the grease of his own hands, and I got to work. First, I drained the diesel and disconnected the fuel lines, carefully placing a coffee can under the main line to catch the drips. The fittings were tight, frozen by years of heat and vibration. I put a wrench on one and a cheater pipe on the other, leaning into it with all my weight until it broke loose with a painful screech of metal on metal. Next came the timing cover. 12 bolts, each one in an awkward position. I barked my knuckles twice, getting the bottom ones loose. With the cover off, I could see the timing marks on the gears. I carefully rotated the engine by hand with a long breaker bar on the crankshaft pulley bolt, watching until the mark on the pump gear lined up perfectly with the one on the cam gear. This was the most critical part. If you were off by even one tooth, you could bend a valve or punch a hole in a piston when you tried to start it. With the engine at top dead center, I unbolted the pump itself. It was heavy, an intricate piece of German engineering from Bosch. I carried it to my workbench like it was a newborn baby and laid it on a clean rag. The smell of diesel was overpowering. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously disassembling it, piece by tiny piece. Springs no bigger than a pen tip, plungers machined to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch, tiny ball bearings and seals. I laid them out in the exact order I removed them on a clean piece of cardboard, following the diagram in the book. I found the culprit. A speck of dirt, almost invisible to the naked eye, had gotten past the filter and lodged in one of the delivery valves, causing it to stick open. It was flooding that cylinder with fuel, which was why it was smoking so bad. I cleaned every single part with carburetor cleaner until it shone, blew out every passage with compressed air, and then carefully, painstakingly, began to reassemble it. My hands, calloused and thick from farm work, had to become a surgeon's hands, manipulating the tiny pieces with a pair of needle-nose pliers and a steady nerve. By the time I was done, it was well past midnight. My back ached, my eyes burned from the solvent fumes, and my hands were stained black with grease and diesel. But the pump was back together. I bolted it back onto the engine, meticulously aligning the timing marks, torqued the bolts to spec, and reconnected the fuel lines. Then came the moment of truth. I bled the air out of the lines, cracking each injector fitting one by one until a clear stream of fuel squirted out. I climbed up into the worn seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter groaned, the engine turned over once, twice, and then it caught. It wasn't the sputtering, coughing start of before, it was a clean, crisp roar, all 6 cylinders firing in perfect time, no black smoke, just a faint puff of white that quickly cleared. The sound was beautiful. It was the sound of victory. The next morning, I was back in the field before the sun came up. I had lost a full day, but I had saved myself a $500 repair bill and a 2-week wait. As I drove, I saw the local banker, Mr. Abernathy, driving his Buick down the road. He slowed as he passed Rich's farm, giving a big, friendly wave toward the new house Rich was building. When he got to my field, he just shook his head slowly and drove on, not even bothering to look my way. The message was clear. In his ledger, I was already a lost cause. The community scorn was a quiet thing, but it was everywhere. At church, people would be polite, but their eyes would slide past me. At the feed store, conversations would stop when I walked in. I was a ghost in my own town, a relic of a bygone era. They saw my old tractor, my patched-up coveralls, my refusal to take on debt, and they didn't see a man of principle. They saw a man of poverty, a failure. But I kept my head down and worked. I finished planting, cultivated the corn when it was knee-high, and watched it grow. My fields looked just as good as Rich's. The corn was just as tall, the ears just as full. The difference was the rain that fell on my crop was watering my corn. The rain that fell on Rich's was watering the bank's corn. He was just the hired man, working for a wage set by interest rates and commodity prices. I was working for myself. I only had to answer to the sky above me and the ground beneath my feet. And that, I figured, was a difference worth fighting for. The early 70s turned into a gold rush for farmers in the heartland. The Russian grain deal of '72 had opened the floodgates. Prices we'd only ever dreamed of became reality. Corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, shot past $2, then $2.50, then kissed $3. Soybeans were even crazier. It felt like you couldn't lose. The whole country was talking about the American farmer, the man who was going to feed the world. For men like Rich Sterling, it was a license to print money. With his massive acreage and brand-new high-capacity equipment, he was hauling staggering amounts of grain to the elevator. Every time a semi-truck loaded with his corn rumbled past my place, it was like a parade celebrating his genius. He traded in the 2-year-old Steiger for a brand-new, even bigger, versatile 875, a 4-wheel drive behemoth with 8 massive tires and a turbocharged engine that you could hear from 2 miles away. He bought another quarter section of land that came up for auction, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. The talk was he paid over $2,000 an acre for it, all financed, of course. Mr. Abernathy from the bank was his shadow, always riding with him in the pickup, a folder full of papers on the seat between them. They were a team, the farmer and the financier, rewriting the rules of agriculture in Cedar County. Rich built his new house, a sprawling brick ranch style that looked more at home in a city suburb than on a country road. He bought his wife a new Cadillac, and he bought himself a base boat with a high-powered Mercury engine. He was living the dream, and he made sure everyone knew it. He'd hold court at the diner, buying coffee for everyone, talking about his yields, his expansion plans, his trips to look at land in Brazil. "You got to think globally, boys," he'd say, leaning back in the booth. "This isn't your grandpa's farm anymore. It's a business, an international business. And the guys who are scared to borrow, scared to expand, well, they're going to get left in the dust. He'd always glance over at me when he said that, a little smirk playing on his lips. I was having good years too. The high prices meant that even on my modest 300 acres, I was making more money than my father ever had. My corn was good, my beans were clean. The checks from the co-op were bigger than I'd ever seen. But my neighbors only saw what I wasn't doing. I didn't buy a new tractor. I didn't buy more land. I didn't build a new house. The first good year, I paid cash for a used but solid John Deere 6600 combine. It was a step up from my old pull type, but it was still 10 years old and a fraction of the cost of the new ones Rich was buying. It had a cab, which felt like a luxury, but no air conditioning. On hot days in September, it was like sitting in an oven, but it got the job done. The next year, I put up a new machine shed. Not a fancy Morton building, but a good solid pole barn that I designed and built myself with the help of a couple neighbors I paid in cash. It was big enough to get all my equipment under a roof, out of the snow and the rain. The rest of the money, the profits from those boom years, I put in the bank. Not with Mr. Abernathy, but at the little credit union in the next town over. It sat there, earning a modest 5% interest. To everyone else, it looked like I was hoarding cash, scared to make a move. They saw my 4020, now nearly 15 years old, still pulling the planter. They saw my 10-year-old Ford pickup with the rust spot on the fender. They saw a man who was afraid of success. One afternoon, Mr. Abernathy cornered me at the post office. He was wearing a crisp suit and a tie, and he smelled of expensive aftershave. "Silas," he began, his voice smooth as butter, "we need to talk. I see your accounts. You're doing well." "Very well. But that money you have sitting in savings, it's lazy money. It's not working for you." "It's safe, Mr. Abernathy," I said. "Safe doesn't buy you another 160 acres, Silas," he countered, lowering his voice. "The old Henderson place is coming up for sale. It borders your north field. You could pick it up, and the bank would be happy to finance it for you. We could roll your current assets into it, use the land as collateral. Land values are only going one way, my boy. Up. It's the only thing they're not making any more of. You could double your operation overnight." He was offering me the same deal he'd offered Rich Sterling, the same deal he was offering every farmer who would listen. It was a siren song of easy money and endless growth. For a moment I was tempted. I imagined my farm twice as big. I imagined pulling a brand new planter with a new tractor, the windows rolled up and the air conditioning blasting. But then I thought of my father. I thought of his worn-out hands, his belief that a man's worth was measured not by the size of his debt, but by the weight of his word. I thought of that old 4020 sitting in my new shed, paid for and clear. Every piece of it belonged to me, not to me and the bank, just to me. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy," I said, meeting his gaze, "but I think I'll just keep farming what I own." He stared at me for a long moment, his friendly smile slowly fading. It was replaced by a look of pity, of condescension. He shook his head, a gesture of a man who simply cannot understand a fool. "You're making a mistake, Silas," he said softly. "A big one. When this boom is over, the men who got big will be the only ones left standing." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the mail in my hand. That winter, the news on the radio started to change. The stories weren't about record exports anymore. They were about oil embargoes, inflation, and something new called the prime interest rate. A man named Paul Volcker was appointed to run the Federal Reserve, and he was talking about tightening the money supply to fight inflation. I didn't know much about economics, but I knew what it felt like when a storm was coming. And as the 70s drew to a close, I could feel a cold wind starting to blow across the heartland, a wind that smelled a lot like trouble. Rich Sterling and the others, high up in the cabs of their mortgaged machines, couldn't feel a thing. But I could. Down on the worn-out seat of my old John Deere, I could feel it right down to my bones. The turn of the decade felt different. The boundless optimism of the 70s, fueled by cheap credit and high prices, began to curdle. 1980 dawned hot and dry. The spring rains never came. By June, the corn in my fields, which should have been knee-high and dark green, was stunted and pale, its leaves starting to curl inward during the heat of the day. a plant's desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The ground, once soft and black, was baked into a concrete hard crust, cracked and grey. The air was filled with the constant high-pitched drone of cicadas, a sound that always felt like the very voice of drought. For me, it was a worry. For Rich Sterling, it was a catastrophe in the making. His massive operating loan was based on projections of 200 bushel corn. The parched fields were promising less than half that. The pressure began to show on him. The easy grin was gone, replaced by a permanent furrow in his brow. I'd see his pickup racing down the gravel roads, kicking up a plume of dust that would hang in the still air for minutes, a frantic ghost of his passing. One sweltering afternoon in July, a thunderstorm finally built on the western horizon. The clouds were a bruised purple, and the air grew heavy and still. It wasn't the gentle, soaking rain we needed, but it was something. I was in my shed, sharpening the blades on my sickle mower, when I heard the roar of Rich's Versatile from across the road. He was trying to get his second cutting of alfalfa baled before the rain hit. The big tractor, pulling a massive New Holland baler, moved with an impressive speed, spitting out huge round bales. Then the sound changed. The steady thrum of the big Cummins engine was interrupted by a sharp, metallic screech, followed by a loud bang. The tractor jerked to a stop in the middle of the field. I watched as Rich climbed down from the cab, his movements stiff with anger. He kicked one of the giant tires, a futile gesture against 8 tons of steel. I saw him get on the radio in his cab, his voice likely crackling with frustration. An hour later, the dealer's service truck pulled in. A young mechanic in clean overalls spent the better part of the afternoon lying on the hot ground under the articulated joint of the big machine. I could see them from my yard, their gestures growing more and more frustrated. Finally, they hooked the Versatile to the service truck, but it was no use. The tractor was dead in the water. The rear differential had apparently disintegrated. It was a catastrophic failure, a 1 in 1,000 breakdown, and the parts would have to be special ordered from the factory in Winnipeg. It would take weeks. The rain came that night, a hard driving downpour that flattened his cut alfalfa and leached the color right out of it, turning a valuable hay crop into worthless moldy bedding. Meanwhile, the news from the wider world grew worse. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn prices, which had been the foundation of all that borrowing and expansion, plummeted from over $3 a bushel back down to $2. It was a punch to the gut for every farmer in the county. The whispers at the co-op changed. They were no longer about Rich Sterling's genius. They were about his debt. Heard the bank put his operating loan on review, one would say. He can't make the payment on that new tractor if it's sitting in the field broke down. Another would add. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, was no longer seen riding shotgun in Rich's pickup. His Buick was now seen parked outside the bank well after closing time, the lights in his office burning late into the night. The cracks in the empire were beginning to show, spreading like the fissures in the dry summer earth. I kept my head down. I greased the fittings on my old 6600 combine, patched a slow leak in a tire, and waited. My crop was poor, but my expenses were low. I had no interest payment coming due. I just had to outlast the weather, and as it turned out, the times themselves. The fall of 1981 was when the cold wind truly began to howl. Paul Volcker, up in Washington, had declared war on inflation, and his weapon of choice was interest rates. The prime rate, the number that dictated the cost of borrowing money, shot up into the stratosphere. It went from single digits to 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. For farmers like Rich, who had built their empires on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The easy money of the 70s had become a venomous serpent, coiling around their necks and squeezing. His loan payments, which were once manageable, became astronomical. The monthly interest on his debt was more than my father had made in a whole year. The math simply didn't work anymore. $2 corn couldn't pay 20% interest. The friendly phone calls from Mr. Abernathy stopped. They were replaced by letters printed on formal bank letterhead, filled with words like delinquent, default, and foreclosure. The end came on a cold, grey Saturday in March of '82. a day that would be seared into the memory of Cedar County forever. The notice had been in the paper for weeks. Public auction by order of the Cedar County First National Bank, the property of Richard Sterling. The auctioneer set up his sound system on a flatbed trailer in the middle of Rich's yard, right in the shadow of the big brick house he had been so proud of. The entire community was there, not out of spite, but out of a kind of morbid, sorrowful duty. It was like attending a funeral. We walked through his machine shed, our boots echoing on the concrete floor. The equipment was all there, lined up neatly, washed and polished. The giant Versatile, finally repaired, looked like a sleeping green monster. The massive planters, the huge chisel plows, the two gleaming red International combines with 30-foot grain heads. It was a breathtaking collection of modern iron, the envy of the county, and every single piece of it was being sold. I saw Rich standing by himself near the fuel barrels, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His wife was inside the house, the curtains drawn. He looked hollowed out, a ghost haunting his own life. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the stoop-shouldered posture of a defeated man. He looked 10 years older than he had just a few years before. Our eyes met for a moment across the yard. There was no animosity in his gaze, only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. I gave him a slow nod, the only thing I could think to do. Mr. Abernathy was there too, standing beside the auctioneer, his face a grim, joyless mask. He wasn't the slick, confident banker anymore. He was just a functionary, a man doing an unpleasant job. The auctioneer started with the small items: tools, shop equipment, spare parts. The bidding was slow, reluctant. Neighbors bought things they didn't need just to put a little money back into Rich's pocket. Then came the big machinery. The Versatile was first. It brought a fraction of what Rich had paid for it. The market was flooded with used equipment from other farm failures. The combines went next, for half their value. I watched as Rich's entire operation, his dream of a modern farming empire, was dismantled and sold off, piece by painful piece, for pennies on the dollar. I didn't bid on any of it. My own shed was full of older, smaller equipment that was all mine. I didn't need a 30-foot grain head or a 300-horsepower tractor. I had survived because I hadn't reached for them. While Rich's dream was being auctioned off, my humble reality was safe and sound, tucked away in my shed across the road. My old 4020 sat there, its engine cold, its value not measured in dollars on an auction block, but in its steadfast refusal to carry a note at the bank. I had weathered the storm not by building a bigger ship, but by having a deeper anchor. And on that bleak March day, as the auctioneer's chant echoed across the frost-covered fields, that felt like the only kind of wealth that truly mattered. The auctioneer finally got to the land. It was sold in parcels. The 800 acres of the old Miller place went first, bought by an out-of-state insurance company for a price that barely covered the mortgage on it. The Henderson place, the one Abernathy had tried to sell me, went to another investor from the city. The crowd grew thinner, the air colder. Finally, there was only one piece left, the last item on the sale bill. "All right, folks," the auctioneer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Now we've got the home quarter, 160 acres with a fine brick home, machine shed, and grain bins, the original Sterling family farm." A heavy silence fell over the remaining crowd. This was different. This wasn't just land, it was a legacy. This was the ground Rich's grandfather had broken with horses. This was where he had grown up. Selling off the expansion acres was business. Selling this was like selling a man's soul. The auctioneer opened the bidding. Silence. He lowered the price. More silence. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home place. It felt wrong, vulturous. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward and whispered to the auctioneer. The auctioneer nodded grimly. "Folks, the bank has an opening bid. We have to protect our interest. I have an opening bid of $1,000 an acre." He looked out at the crowd. "Do I hear 1,100? I looked over at Rich. He was staring at the ground, his jaw tight. He was losing everything. Not just his business, but his history, his name on the mailbox. In that moment, all the years of his condescension, his laughter at my old tractor, it all just melted away. I didn't see a rival. I saw a neighbor being broken by a system that had built him up just to tear him down. I thought of my father and his belief that a community was supposed to hold itself together, not pick over the bones of its fallen. I raised my hand. "I have 1100 from Silas Blackwood," the auctioneer barked, a flicker of surprise in his voice. "Do I hear 12? The crowd turned to look at me. Their faces were a mixture of shock and confusion. I was the last man they expected to bid. I was the relic, the man who was farming in the past. Mr. Abernathy stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He knew I didn't borrow money. He knew if I was bidding, it was with my own cash. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the quiet yard. "To Silas Blackwood, for $1,100 an acre." I walked over to the clerk's table, my legs feeling unsteady. I wrote the check from my account at the credit union, the one that held the profits from all those good years. The money I had saved instead of spending, it nearly cleaned me out, but it was enough. As I signed my name, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't triumph. It was a heavy, somber responsibility. After the crowd had dispersed and the auctioneers had packed up their equipment, I saw Rich still standing by the shed. I walked over to him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the empty yard. "Silas," he said, his voice raspy. He couldn't look at me. "You came to see the show, to watch me fall?" "No, Rich," I said quietly. "I didn't." He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. "Then why? Why buy it? To tear down my house? To plow under my yard?" "I want to make you a deal," I said, my words coming out slow and steady. "You can stay. You and your family can stay in the house. You can rent it from me, $1 a year, and I could use some help. My equipment is old, and you're a good mechanic. I'll pay you a fair wage." He stared at me, speechless. The anger and bitterness in his face slowly gave way to sheer, uncomprehending shock. "Why?" he finally whispered. "After everything. After how I treated you." "Because this is your home, Rich," I said, gesturing to the land around us. "It was your father's home, and his father's before him. A man shouldn't lose his home. The business, that was just business. This is different." Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time he didn't try to hide them. He just nodded, unable to speak. We stood there in the fading light, two farmers who had taken two very different paths, arriving at an unexpected crossroads. I hadn't set out to be vindicated. I had only set out to be free. And in that moment I realized that true freedom wasn't just about being out of debt yourself. It was about having the strength and the grace to help a neighbor who was drowning in it. The 80s were hard years, but we all got through them. Rich took my offer. He worked for me for 5 years, his natural talent for farming and mechanics shining through now that the crushing weight of debt was gone. He was quiet, humbled, but he was a good man and a hard worker. He helped me keep my old machinery running, and I taught him how to rebuild an injector pump on a workbench instead of just replacing it. We became friends, a friendship forged in the ashes of his ruin and the quiet stability of my principles. Eventually, he saved enough to buy a small farm of his own, a few towns over. He bought it with cash. The community changed too. The talk at the diner was no longer about who had the biggest tractor or the most land. It was about who had the lowest debt, who had a good crop in the bin, paid for. They started looking at me differently. They didn't see a relic anymore. They saw a survivor. They saw wisdom in my caution. Men would come to me for advice, not about financing, but about fixing a hydraulic leak or setting a plow just right. I had become what my father was, a respected elder, not for my wealth, but for my knowledge and my steadiness. I farmed that home quarter of riches for the rest of my life, alongside my own land. I never tore down the fences or built a bigger house. I just tended it, carefully and respectfully. Years later, when I was an old man and my own hair was white, my grandson, a boy of 10, was riding with me on the old 4020. Its green paint was almost completely gone in places, worn down to the primer and the bare steel by decades of sun and work. The seat was patched with duct tape and the engine wheezed a little on cold mornings, but it still ran. "Grandpa," the boy asked, his voice barely audible over the familiar rumble of the diesel engine, "why do we still use this old tractor? All the other farmers have new ones with computers and air conditioning." I throttled the engine down and let it idle, the rhythmic popping of the two-cylinder a comforting beat. I pointed to the faded decal on the hood. "You see that, son?" I said. "That tractor taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about farming bigger. It's about farming smarter. It's about the difference between what you want and what you need." I looked out over the fields, bathed in the golden light of a late afternoon sun. This land, this tractor, they don't belong to a bank. They belong to us. We don't owe anyone for them. That means we answer to no one but God and the weather. Some people spend their whole lives chasing a dream that belongs to somebody else. They get so leveraged up, they end up working for the bank, not for themselves. They forget that the goal isn't just to farm the land, it's to own your soul. The boy was quiet, thinking about that. I pushed the throttle forward again, and the old John Deere dug in, pulling the plow through the rich black earth, turning over another furrow, preparing the ground for another season. The sound of its engine was more than just noise. It was the sound of independence. It was the sound of a legacy, paid for not with borrowed money, but with sweat, patience, and the hard-won wisdom of a man who had watched the future roar by and had been content to hold his ground.